For decades, one ingredient showed up in almost every scoop of cheap vanilla ice cream, every bottle of cream soda, and most of the candy you could buy for a nickel at any corner store in America. It tasted like vanilla, sort of. Warmer though, and deeper, with a cherry almond sweetness underneath that real vanilla never quite delivered. Bakers loved it, candy makers swore by it. Soda companies built whole product lines around it. What nobody knew at the time was that the compound behind all of that flavor came from a wrinkled black seed the size of an almond, harvested from wild trees growing along the banks of the Orinoco River in Venezuela. And the FDA was about to pull it off every shelf in the country. That was 1954. By the following year, the bean was gone from American kitchens, not phased out, not restricted, banned. And the strange part, the part that still makes food scientists shake their heads, is that the same chemical that got it banned is sitting in your spice cabinet right now, inside something you probably used this morning. This is the story of the Tonka bean. How does a flavor that dominated American sweets for nearly a century end up completely illegal overnight? The answer starts in the rainforests of northern South America. The coumarin tree, known scientifically as Dipteryx odorata, grows wild across Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, and Guyana. Despite its name, the Tonka bean is not technically a bean in the way you would think of a kidney bean or a lima bean. The tree belongs to the pea family, Fabaceae, which makes it a distant relative of lentils and soybeans, but the tonka itself is a seed inside a fleshy, egg-shaped fruit. The tree can grow up to 160 feet tall. Its trunk stretches clear and straight for 60 to 80 feet before the first branches appear, and the wood is so dense and durable that it is used in boat building, flooring, and tool handles. In South America, the lumber goes by the trade name Brazilian teak. The seeds inside the coumarin tree's fruit are the tonka beans. They look like shriveled raisins from the outside, dark brown to black, wrinkled, with a smooth, lighter interior when you crack one open. And then there is the smell. If you have never held a tonka bean to your nose, imagine vanilla crossed with warm cherry, almond paste, fresh hay, and a faint whisper of pipe tobacco. Chefs who have worked with it describe the aroma as intoxicating. The French love it so much they coined the phrase fièvre tonka, or tonka fever, a play on the French word for bean, fève. One food writer described it as vanilla's more sophisticated cousin. That entire aromatic profile comes from a single molecule, coumarin. In 1820, a German scientist named August Vogel isolated coumarin from the tonka bean for the first time. He actually mistook it for benzoic acid. That same year, a French pharmacist named Nicolas Guibord made the same isolation, realized it was something entirely new, and named it coumarin, from coumaru, the French word for the tonka bean, which itself came from the old Tupi word coumaru, the indigenous name for the tree. So even the word coumarin traces back to this one specific seed from the South American jungle. I mean, think about that for a second. A molecule that would eventually show up in an estimated 30% of all perfumes on the market, in one of the most widely prescribed medications in modern medicine, and on the FDA's official list of banned food additives, all carries the name of a single tropical seed that indigenous communities in Venezuela had been using carefully, in small doses, for centuries before any European ever touched it. The Mapoyo people and other communities along the Orinoco had their own relationship with this tree. Elders advised consuming no more than 3 fruits per day. Local knowledge held that too much could cause fever or body aches. They understood moderation. They understood dosage. In their hands, the tonka bean was medicine, carefully administered with respect for its potency. The problem started when Western markets decided that respect was inefficient. By the 1840s, European demand for the bean exploded. Tobacco companies wanted coumarin to sweeten their pipe blends and give smoking a warmer, more fragrant experience. Perfume houses in Paris realized that coumarin gave them a warm, powdery, hay-sweet base note they could not replicate with anything else. Then, in 1868, an English chemist named William Henry Perkin figured out how to synthesize coumarin in a laboratory. 9 years later, by 1877, he had scaled that process to industrial production. And by the 1940s, synthetic coumarin had become exceptionally cheap to manufacture. That cheapness changed everything for the American food industry. Suddenly, any food manufacturer who wanted a vanilla-adjacent flavor could get it for a fraction of the cost of real vanilla beans. Real vanilla required hand-pollinated orchids grown in tropical climates with years of cultivation, harvesting, and curing before a single pod was ready. Tonka extract and synthetic coumarin could be ordered by the barrel. The economics were not even close. Tonka-derived coumarin flooded into American candy, baked goods, ice cream, cream soda, confectionery, and chocolate. Pipe tobacco got sweetened with it. Liqueurs got flavored with it. Even Mexican vanilla extract, the kind tourists brought home in big cheap bottles from border towns, often contained tonka bean extract instead of actual vanilla. That practice, by the way, still happens today. If you have ever bought a suspiciously inexpensive bottle of vanilla extract in Mexico, odds are decent. The vanilla flavor came partly from coumarin. If you ate something that tasted vaguely like vanilla between about 1900 and 1954, there is a real chance the flavor you were tasting was coumarin, not vanillin, from an actual vanilla orchid. Entire generations grew up eating tonka and calling it vanilla. They never knew the difference. The flavor of their childhood desserts, their birthday cakes, their favorite penny candy, a good chunk of it was tonka, and nobody told them because nobody had to. It was cheap, it was legal, and it tasted better than synthetic vanillin in many applications. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, the Sarrapia trade was booming. Sarrapia is the Venezuelan Spanish name for the tonka bean, and the workers who harvested them in the forests of Bolivar state were called sarrapieros. Venezuela began shipping Sarrapia from the port of Ciudad Bolivar in 1847. By 1942, production had peaked, with hundreds of tons of beans leaving the Orinoco Delta every year for European and American markets. The sarrapieros worked deep in the forest, collecting fallen fruits during the harvest season from January through April, cracking open the tough outer husks, extracting the seeds, and curing them by soaking in barrels of rum. As the beans dried, a crystallized white coating of coumarin bloomed on their surface, intensifying that sweet, complex aroma that perfumers and food manufacturers prized. The cured beans were hauled by hand to river trading posts along the Orinoco, loaded onto boats, and shipped out through Ciudad Bolivar. The labor was grueling and the pay was low. The profits flowed to European trading houses and fragrance companies. The same pattern that played out with rubber, cacao, and a dozen other tropical commodities. Each kumaru tree produces fruit only once every 2 to 3 years, and 300 to 400 fruits are needed to yield a single kilogram of cured Sarrapia. The trees could not be rushed or farmed like annual crops. They operated on their own timeline, which made the supply chain fragile from the start. And then the science arrived. Researchers in the 20th century started testing coumarin on laboratory animals, specifically dogs and rats. They fed them high doses of the compound over extended periods. The results showed liver toxicity, a condition scientists call hepatotoxicity, and in some cases, tumors. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense to a lot of food scientists. The doses used in those animal studies were enormous, compared to anything a person would ever consume through food. A single tonka bean contains enough flavor to season up to 80 dishes. You read that correctly. 1 bean, 80 dishes. To experience any toxic effects from coumarin, a person would need to eat roughly 30 whole beans in a short period. Nobody does that. Nobody has ever done that. Not the Mapoyo communities who had been using these beans for centuries. Not the French pastry chefs who grate a tiny shaving over a crème brûlée, not even the most reckless home cook. On top of that, later research showed that human bodies metabolize coumarin differently than the rodents used in the original studies. Humans are generally more efficient at neutralizing coumarin's potentially harmful byproducts than rats are. None of that mattered to the FDA. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. On March 5, 1954, the FDA published the order in the Federal Register. Coumarin was officially classified as a prohibited food additive. The regulation, eventually codified as Title 21, Section 189.130 of the Code of Federal Regulations, uses language that leaves no room for interpretation. Any food containing any added coumarin, whether as a pure substance or as a constituent of tonka beans or tonka extract, is deemed adulterated. Adulterated. That is the same legal term used for food contaminated with rat droppings, industrial solvents, or dangerous chemicals. Applied to a bean that had been flavoring American sweets for half a century. Applied to a seed that indigenous communities had eaten safely for generations. No one had died. No one had been hospitalized. The ban was precautionary, based entirely on animal studies using doses no human would ever encounter through food. And just like that, overnight, the tonka bean disappeared from American food. The Venezuelan Sarrapia trade collapsed almost immediately. The FDA ban, combined with the rising availability of cheap synthetic vanillin as a replacement, gutted demand. By the mid-1960s, the industry had shrunk to almost nothing. The Sarrapieros, who had built their livelihoods around harvesting these beans, watched the market evaporate. The wild kumaru trees kept growing along the Orinoco, some of them centuries old, but almost nobody was buying their seeds anymore. American food manufacturers simply swapped in synthetic vanillin and moved on. Consumers never noticed. The ice cream tasted slightly different, but nobody could put a finger on why. The cream soda lost a little depth, but the brand names stayed the same. An entire flavor profile, the one that a generation of Americans had grown up associating with vanilla, quietly vanished from the food supply. The perfume industry, though, never let go. Coumarin had been one of the foundational ingredients in modern perfumery since the late 1800s. When the French perfumer Paul Parquet created Fougère Royale in 1882, he used coumarin as a central note. And that fragrance launched an entire family of perfumes called fougères, meaning fern-like, that persists to this day. Coumarin gave perfumers a warm, hay-sweet, powdery base, note that nothing else could replicate. The 1954 ban applied only to food, not to cosmetics, not to fragrance. So the perfume houses in Paris and New York kept buying coumarin and tonka bean absolute as though nothing had changed. Because for them, nothing had. Today, by some estimates, roughly 30% of all fragrances on the market contain coumarin in some form. The molecule that is too dangerous to put in your ice cream is one of the most successful materials in the history of things people put on their skin. If you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We cover forgotten food history, backyard growing secrets, and the strange stories behind ingredients every week. By the late 1950s, the tonka bean was already fading from American memory. Vanilla had reclaimed its position as the default sweet flavor, and synthetic vanillin had become so cheap and ubiquitous that hardly anyone questioned what they were tasting. Now, here is where this story turns from interesting to genuinely absurd. The same compound that got the tonka bean banned, coumarin, is naturally present in cassia cinnamon. And cassia cinnamon is the common type of cinnamon sold in virtually every grocery store in the United States. It contains up to 1% coumarin by weight. You can buy it by the jar, sprinkle it on your oatmeal, bake it into cookies by the dozen, stir it into your morning coffee, and nobody from the FDA will ever knock on your door. The legal distinction the FDA draws rests on a single word in the regulation: added. The ban applies to coumarin that is added to food. It does not apply to coumarin that occurs naturally in other ingredients. Cinnamon's coumarin was never added to cinnamon. It grew there, so cinnamon gets a pass. The tonka bean, where the coumarin is also naturally occurring inside the seed, does not get that same treatment because using a tonka bean in food counts as adding its coumarin to the dish. If you're wondering how that logic holds up, so is everyone else. Coumarin also occurs naturally in lavender. Lavender shows up in lemonade, ice cream, cocktails, and baked goods across American restaurants and grocery stores, totally legal. Strawberries contain trace amounts of coumarin. Cherries contain it. Licorice contains it. That smell of fresh-cut grass on a summer Saturday morning, the one that makes you think of childhood and lawnmowers? That is coumarin, the same molecule. The same compound that the FDA says is too dangerous to eat. Yet the Tonka bean sits alone on the ban list. The irony goes deeper than grocery store shelves, much deeper. The same year, the FDA banned coumarin as a food additive, 1954. The agency also approved Warfarin for use as a human medication. Warfarin, one of the most widely prescribed blood thinners in the history of modern medicine, and its entire origin story traces back to coumarin. In the early 1920s, cattle across the northern United States and Canada started hemorrhaging. They bled after minor surgical procedures. Sometimes they bled spontaneously, with no apparent cause. Farmers were losing animals, and veterinarians had no explanation. The common thread turned out to be feed. The affected cattle had all been eating spoiled sweet clover hay. Sweet clover, like the Tonka bean, contains coumarin. And when fungi in improperly stored hay break coumarin down during spoilage, the degradation product is a potent anticoagulant called decoumarol. In February of 1933, a Wisconsin farmer drove through a blizzard to the University of Wisconsin. He brought a dead heifer in the back of his truck, a bucket of blood that refused to clot, and a bale of the hay he suspected was responsible. He hauled all of it to the door of Carl Paul Link, a biochemist. Link and his team spent 6 years working on the problem. On June 28, 1939, Link's graduate student, Harold Campbell, finally crystallized decoumarol, isolating the hemorrhagic agent for the first time. The clock was already ticking. Link's lab just couldn't hear it yet. Link saw potential far beyond veterinary medicine. If a coumarin derivative could prevent blood from clotting, it could kill rodents efficiently and cheaply. His lab synthesized 150 different variations of the compound. Variation number 42 turned out to be the most potent. Link named it Warfarin, combining the initials of the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which had funded the research, with the ending of coumarin. Warfarin was patented as a rat poison in 1948. Within 6 years, it had been completely repurposed. The FDA approved it for use as an anticoagulant medication in humans. The same compound, variation number 42 from a dead farmer's moldy hay, traced back through decoumarol to the coumarin in a tropical seed, became a drug prescribed to millions of patients to prevent strokes, heart attacks, and blood clots. It is still prescribed today. So, in 1954, the FDA made 2 decisions about the same chemical family within the same year. They banned coumarin in your food, and they approved a coumarin derivative for your bloodstream. And the timing of that? Almost too perfect. The ban did not stop everyone, of course. In 2006, Grant Achatz, the chef behind Alinea in Chicago, one of the most celebrated restaurants in America, mentioned in an interview that he used Tonka beans on his menu. Alinea had been named the best restaurant in America by Gourmet magazine that same year. Shortly after the interview, the FDA showed up. They asked if they could look in his spice cabinet, then conducted a search of the kitchen looking for the banned ingredient. Whether they actually found any is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the raid did not slow Achatz down at all. 2 years later, his official Alinea cookbook included a recipe for Tonka bean sponge cake, published, printed, and sold in bookstores across the country. A recipe for a banned ingredient in a cookbook from the best restaurant in America. Achatz even claimed he had not realized Tonka beans were illegal when he started ordering them from a spice merchant, which, honestly, is believable because unless you go looking for the regulation, there is no warning label on the bean, no FDA notice in spice catalogs, and no reason a chef buying from a legal vendor would think twice about it. And Achatz was far from the only American chef treating the ban as more of a suggestion than a law. Michelin-starred restaurants in New York and other cities have quietly used Tonka beans in desserts for years. Chefs grate it over panna cotta, stir it into custard, fold it into chocolate mousse, and use it as the base flavor in crème brûlée. The appeal is simple. Vanilla gives you one note. Tonka gives you 5 or 6 notes layered on top of each other, a depth that makes a simple dessert taste like it took hours longer to prepare than it actually did. Half a single bean, roughly 0.6 to 0.8 grams, is enough to flavor a full liter of ice cream base. Chefs at high-end spots like Le Bernardin in New York reportedly bought the beans despite the prohibition. Pastry chefs across the country order them online from specialty vendors who sell them for, and this is the official wording, non-food purposes, such as cosmetics and tobacco flavoring. Everyone understands the wink. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The enforcement gap tells its own story. The United States is actually the leading importer of Tonka beans in the world, specifically for the tobacco industry. The beans are legal to possess, legal to sell, legal to put in perfume, and an estimated 30% of all fragrances currently on the market contain coumarin or Tonka bean absolute. You can spray coumarin on your neck before dinner. You just cannot put it in your dinner. Too dangerous for your dessert. Perfectly fine for your cologne, for your candles, for the pipe tobacco your neighbor smokes on his porch. Europe looked at the same science and reached a completely different conclusion. The European Union allows coumarin in food at regulated levels, between 2 and 25 milligrams per kilogram, depending on the product. French pastry chefs use Tonka beans openly and without any legal anxiety. German Christmas cookies routinely contain coumarin through cassia cinnamon, and the bakers have never been raided. The European Food Safety Authority set a tolerable daily intake and let the food industry operate within those limits. The difference comes down to regulatory philosophy. The FDA treats coumarin as a substance that was banned before the modern food additive approval system existed. The ban has never been formally revisited. Nobody has petitioned the FDA to re-examine the evidence using modern toxicology. The burden falls on anyone who wants to prove it is safe enough to allow, and nobody has been willing to spend the money or the legal effort to try. Europe acknowledged the risk, set measurable boundaries, and trusted professionals to stay within them. One approach says, if we are not sure it is safe, ban it forever. The other says, if we know the safe amount, regulate it. Both systems are trying to prevent the same harm. They just disagree completely about whether careful use should be permitted. For anyone interested in growing their own food and controlling what ends up on their plate, the Tonka bean raises a question that extends way beyond one ingredient. The kumaru tree needs tropical conditions to grow. It wants temperatures between 22 and 30 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall around 2,000 to 2,500 millimeters. And well-drained, slightly acidic soil with a pH between 5.5 and 6.5. You cannot grow one in a backyard in Ohio or a raised bed in Vermont. It is not a weekend gardening project. The trees themselves are worth respecting even from a distance. A mature kumaru can live for centuries. It produces fruit on its own schedule every 2 to 3 years and cannot be rushed. Each tree yields somewhere between half a kilogram and up to 25 kilograms of beans under optimal conditions, depending on age, soil, and rainfall. In some South American traditions, the Tonka bean carried significance beyond food and medicine. In parts of French Guiana, there is an old ritual for granting wishes. You hold a Tonka bean in one hand, hold a snake in the other, and cast the bean into a river. Whether or not that works, it tells you something about how seriously people have taken this seed for a very long time. The principle underneath the ban matters to anyone who has ever planted a seed and wondered where the line falls between food safety and food freedom. A compound that occurs naturally in cinnamon, lavender, cherries, strawberries, and fresh-cut grass sits banned as a food additive because of rat studies from the 1950s. The ban has never been updated. The science has moved forward considerably, but the regulation has not moved at all. And the people most affected by the gap are the chefs and food producers who would use tiny, carefully measured amounts, the way French and German chefs already do legally, if they were allowed to. The bean was never the problem. The dosage in the rat studies was the problem. And the regulatory framework that treated a ban from 1954 as permanent, rather than revisiting it with modern toxicology, is the reason the bean is still off-limits in American food today. No one has ever died from eating a tonka bean. The FDA's own regulations do not claim anyone has. The ban was precautionary, and it has outlived every generation of food scientists who originally supported it. Meanwhile, in France, a chef is grating a tonka bean over a bowl of warm custard right now, legally, with the full approval of the European food safety system. One shaving from that single bean will flavor the entire dessert with something warmer and more layered than vanilla has ever been. A taste described by food writers as cherry and almond and hay and tobacco woven together. The flavor of a molecule first isolated over 200 years ago, from the seed of a wild tree that can outlive the buildings around it. In 1954, the FDA said coumarin was safe enough to put in your bloodstream as medicine, just not in your custard. And that contradiction, written into law in the same year by the same agency, is still on the books today. The real question is not whether the tonka bean is dangerous. It is why nobody has bothered to ask the FDA to look at the evidence again.